There's a new global power struggle happening right now, and it's quietly defining our entire era. This isn't a war fought with armies and tanks, but a really high stakes contest for the future itself, the growing rivalry between the United States and China.
And at the absolute heart of this whole conflict is one single massive question: who is going to dominate the next industrial age? This isn't about politics or trade numbers. It's a fundamental fight for technological and economic supremacy that will literally shape the 21st century.
All right, so here's our game plan to unpack all of this. First, we'll look at the new kind of war happening now. Then we'll rewind to the original Cold War to get some much needed context. After that, we'll explore how the world shifted from that bipolar setup to something called geoeconomics. We'll compare the old and new rivalries, see where India fits into this puzzle, and finally, we'll wrap up with the key takeaways for your exams. Okay, let's dive right in. A new kind of war. You see, the current tension between the US and China didn't just pop up out of nowhere. Its most recent, intense phase really started to heat up back around 2016. So, how did we get to where we are today? Well, it's been a slow burn. Back in 2018, things got really serious when the US slapped tariffs of over 100% on some goods. And of course, China hit back hard. They tried a truce in 2020, but it kind of fizzled out. Then the Biden administration came in and not only kept the tariffs, but also introduced the CHIPS Act to supercharge its own semiconductor industry. And that brings us to today, where things are only getting more intense, with threats of even more US tariffs and China starting to restrict exports of rare earth elements. And those are the critical minerals you need for basically all modern tech.
Now, to really, and I mean really understand what makes this new conflict so different, we've got to look back at the original blueprint. So let's take a step back in time to the First Cold War, the rivalry that basically defined the world from 1950 to 1990.
The original Cold War was all about a bipolar world, two completely opposite teams. On one side, you had the US-led bloc, built on democratic capitalism. They used economic carrots, like the Marshall Plan, to build their alliance. You could say their power came from prosperity. But on the other side, you had the Soviet-led Comecon bloc. Theirs was a world of military communism. Their power didn't come from economic partnerships, it came from raw military might. This is a crucial point. The very foundation of their power was totally different.
So these were the main players in that Soviet Comecon bloc. Now that's a list that can be tricky to remember for an exam, right? So here's a little trick for you. Just remember the phrase, "A big cat eats Hungarian pork and roast." A for Albania, B for Bulgaria, C for Czechoslovakia. You get the idea. A big cat eats Hungarian pork and roast. A handy mnemonic to keep them all straight.
Now, this intense superpower rivalry created a really fascinating, almost paradoxical side effect. It's a key term you should know, the democratic dividend. Basically, it refers to the strategic benefits that countries who weren't aligned with either side could get simply by playing the two giants off each other. Both Washington and Moscow were competing for influence, and that created opportunities. And India is a perfect textbook example of a country that benefited from this. Just look at two incredibly critical moments in our history, the 1962 war with China and the terrible drought of 66-67. In both cases, even though our political ties with the US were pretty strained, they still provided aid. Why would they do that? Simple. For Washington, the strategic cost of letting a country as important as India potentially drift towards the Soviet camp was just way too high. That, right there, is the democratic dividend in action. But as we all know, that bipolar world wasn't built to last. The whole global order was about to be flipped on its head, and something totally new was about to rise from the ashes, the age of geoeconomics. And the shift, when it came, happened incredibly fast. It all kicked off in the mid-1980s with Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union. Those reforms, maybe unintentionally, led to the complete collapse of the USSR. And just like that, the 40-year-long ideological staring contest that had defined the entire planet was over. A completely new logic started driving how nations dealt with each other. And that new logic has a name, another key term for you: geoeconomics. So what does it mean? Put simply, it's when a country uses its economic power, things like trade, investment, technology, as its main foreign policy weapon. The new battleground wasn't about tanks and missiles anymore. It was about supply chains, microchips, and economic influence. Okay, so if the new battlefield is geoeconomics, it makes sense that the rules of the game have totally changed. And this brings us right to the heart of our analysis.
a head-to-head comparison of the old Cold War and this new one.
Now, this slide is absolutely crucial. The Soviet Union's power was all about military might. As long as their nuclear arsenal was a credible threat, their economy could be a mess. It didn't really matter to their global standing. But China's power? It's based on economic entanglement. Its strength is completely tied up with its role in the global economy. So here's a mnemonic to lock this in for your exams. The old war was M&M, military might. The new war is E&E, economic entanglement.
And this is where things get really interesting, because that economic dependence creates massive vulnerabilities for China that the old Soviet Union never had to worry about. China is exposed to things like an economic slowdown, a serious demographic crisis, and the problem of overinvesting in things like their famous ghost cities. But most importantly, it desperately relies on the very markets it's competing against, especially the US. A trade war hurts China's internal stability in a way that just never could have touched the insulated Soviet leadership. So, with all that in mind, this new world of geoeconomics and economic entanglement, where does that leave a country like India? Let's zoom in on India's very delicate balancing act in this new global order.
When you look at India's economy today, one thing is just crystal clear. Our modern growth engine, the powerhouse IT sector that we're so proud of, is fundamentally and deeply wired into the US market. This isn't some small detail. It's the economic reality that underpins so many of our foreign policy decisions. This deep connection makes us incredibly sensitive to whatever happens in Washington. And this quote right here from the source material just nails the dilemma India's facing. See, back in the old Cold War, you could kind of separate your geopolitics, like maintaining good ties with Russia, from your economics. But in this new age of geoeconomics, you just can't do that anymore. Like the quote says, making political moves without backing them up with your economics, well, that's no longer sufficient. Your economic interests and your political moves have to be in sync.
All right, we have covered a lot of ground. So before we wrap up, let's bring it all together and review the most important points from our discussion. Think of this as your exam revision cheat sheet.
First, the original Cold War. The key things to remember, it was a bipolar world, a standoff between the US OECD and the USSR Comecon. This created a weird kind of stability and gave rise to the democratic dividend, which, as we saw, really benefited countries like India. And of course, this whole era came to a crashing halt with the Soviet collapse. Next up, the new Cold War. What's the core conflict here? It's a fight for global technological leadership. The main driving force isn't ideology, it's geoeconomics. And the key difference from the old days, China's power comes from economic interdependence, which is both a strength and a weakness. And never forget China's major internal vulnerabilities: demographics, overinvestment, and its reliance on foreign markets. And finally, India's position and the big picture outlook. India's main challenge is this delicate balance between its US-linked IT sector on one side and its political history on the other. The new economic reality is that politics and economics can't be separated anymore, and this leads us to the source's pretty provocative conclusion. With Europe, Russia, and even China all facing serious problems, we might be heading back to a unipolar world, one dominated again by the US. And that leaves us with a huge, critical question for the future, one I want you to really think about. If the world truly is becoming unipolar again, and if the rules are now written by economics, how can a nation like India genuinely carve out its own, truly independent path? It's a question that is going to define our nation's story for decades to come. Thanks for joining this explainer.